So let's move on to the next key findings. So remember, there are 10. We finished one. So the second one says cities in low and lower middle income countries face the highest level of projected climate change related hazards. This is important to remember because that determines the room you have in your budget for dealing with climate hazards. We'll see at shocks and stresses as well. Dealing with them as just disaster management versus also having room in the budgets for longer term preparations in terms of enhancing resilience, reducing vulnerabilities, and so on. Projected climate change related hazards are strongest for cities in low and lower middle income countries. Average weighted overall climate change related hazard exposure by city size and country income group. As we remember, risk is a combination or a multiplication of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and now in AR6 response has also been added. Exposure typically depends on population density, infrastructure, and various factors like that. Intuitively, we have a sense of exposure, but a heat wave over a rich part of the neighborhood in a city will not expose the people to the same level of hazard as in the poor neighborhood. So exposure has something to do with the socioeconomic factors and population density, etc. as well. So large cities, climate hazard exposure is up here in terms of some score, which you can go and read about. And medium cities, you can see it goes from a lower level up to the lower score than the maximum score here for large cities. And for small cities, it covers a little bit more of the lower end. So you have within that the blue, green, and this color, whatever this is, some kind of a blue. These are high income, upper middle income, and low and lower middle income. So the climate hazard exposure score is higher for the lower income levels. Key finding 3: cities in low and lower middle income countries are less resilient to increasingly frequent climate change related shocks and stresses. So this is about how you recover after you've been kicked by a climate related shock or a stress. Okay, so obviously that's a function of vulnerability, but also about all the tools you have to deal with recovering after the shock, which could include availability of finance and what kind of housing you are living in, infrastructure, access to water, energy, and so on. Cities in low and lower middle income countries are less resilient to climate change related shocks and stresses. Estimated impact of extreme weather, hot, dry, wet, and tropical cyclone events on a city's level of nighttime light intensity, April 2012 to December 2020. So that's used as an index here. Large cities, so this is the estimated impact in terms of percentage. So you can think of the negative impact being larger, means it's worse for the people in terms of exposure or resilience. So you have low and lower middle income countries in this bluish color, and green color is upper middle income and high income. So for medium cities, they overlap here in terms of estimated impact, in terms of the resilience estimated here as the city's level of nighttime light intensity. So it's an indicator of how quickly people have gotten back to energy and hence activities, a normal life in some sense, and so on. Here the impact, large cities can be have some resilience versus very low resilience as well. The figure here shows a little bit more of this. For cities in lower income countries, dry, hot, and wet weather anomalies have larger negative impacts when they reinforce baseline climatic conditions. So if you're living in a hot and humid city like let's say Mumbai, or a very polluted city like Delhi or Beijing, you can have these things be exacerbated by the climate anomalies riding on top of the baseline climate conditions. Estimated impacts of dry, hot, wet, and cold anomalies on cities in low and lower middle income countries with dry, hot, wet, and cold baseline climates respectively again for April 2012 to December 2020. This is the estimated impact. Dry here, it goes at -6 in terms of estimated impact. Hot, wet, and cold. So cold is positive here, and you have to go back and make sure how the baselines are defined and what it means to be in this range and in this range. So estimated impacts are worse for this is blue again is cold baseline climate, so it depends on where the city is and what kind of a shock it is experiencing and how it's being affected, affecting the people. Okay. Key finding 4: construction in countries is gravitating toward cities that will be most affected by climate change. So the growth, development, and people's internal movements and construction, etc., are mostly driven by socioeconomic activities and social pulls, investments from businesses and so on, which can then have a feedback to grow towards those places which are already growing and having positive impact on employment, investment, finance, economic growth, development, and so on. So you will continue to attract more and more construction towards those. Climate change then basically takes a back seat. Okay. Within countries, construction of tall buildings of all heights is occurring faster in cities that will be most affected by climate change, so future bad locations. Now there is more and more work required by banks to look at investing, but also considering climate risk profiles before investing in such situations. Estimated effects of future bad location index on construction of buildings above various heights from 1920 to 2020. So that's a long time series here. Effect of future bad locations index, so that's defined in some way, and 1985 VILAC conference here, and the Kyoto Protocol came in here. So you are looking at height of the buildings greater than or equal to 55 meters have taken off exponentially since about since about the Kyoto Protocol. No relation really, but still. Greater than 100 meters, greater than 120, 140, 170, and 195 meters. So obviously the taller buildings are fewer in number, but you can see that the growth rates are pretty similar to taller buildings, and they're all moving into regions or urbanization happening in future bad locations from the climate risk perspective. So it depends on how the developers and the governments perceive risk in that case. So they may say risk is uncertain, economic growth is important, so they will just bet on that and then maybe pay the price if climate risks do work out to be really bad. Lack of inclusiveness contributes to the lack of resilience of lower middle income countries. Obviously, as we said before, resilience and how fast you recover obviously depends on lack of on the income level. So here, access to improved sanitation and safely managed drinking water is worse in cities in low and lower middle income countries. So I won't go through the details, but share of households with access to improved sanitation and safely managed drinking water by city type circa 2015. So here is the score in terms of share of households in percentages and access to improved sanitation, access to safely managed water. You can see lower income is a lower percentage of households, and it's larger for large cities, but medium and small cities have lower percentages, and maximum percentages in the upper middle income are also lower for middle and small cities compared to larger cities. And low and lower middle income people have far lower percentage of households with sanitation and safely managed drinking water. Here you can see that large cities has a larger range just because you have larger socioeconomic band in larger cities. Medium cities sit here and small cities sit here, with low and lower middle income countries having fairly small, relatively small percentage of households with safely managed drinking water. So maybe I can leave this here and come back, or maybe I'll just finish this. Okay. How this report defines inclusiveness. Since we just looked at inclusiveness here, let's just do this. In this report, inclusiveness is broadly considered in terms of ability or opportunity and outcomes. Inclusion is defined as the ability and opportunity of all who reside in a city to fully participate in market services and spaces, including political, physical, cultural, and social, thereby enabling them to lead their lives with dignity. Essentially, this is kind of an access issue to all the services, markets, and spaces. And inclusiveness always means agency, right? If you are willing to act, then you should have the opportunity to act by participating in markets, in accessing services and accessing spaces as well, whether they are political, physical, cultural, or social. Seems obvious, yet measuring them is important and tricky. Consistent with that definition, this report variously discusses how cities differ globally in the access they provide to basic urban services, financial services, digital technologies, and labor market opportunities. It also shines a spotlight on multidimensional exclusion and touches on issues of voice. So exclusion is not just financial or health services or energy services, but it could be cultural exclusion, it could be political exclusion and social exclusion, and so on. As for outcomes, this report analyzes, among other things, how cities vary globally in terms of both their rates of poverty and their levels of income inequality. So poverty is one thing as an absolute measure, and income equality is another thing as a measure. The levels of socioeconomic mobility they afford their residents, especially new migrants, gender differentiated patterns of population displacement following climate-related natural disasters, and the differential impacts of exposure to extreme heat on segments of a city's workforce, including informal versus formal, female versus male, and older versus younger workers. So there are many levels of measuring the inclusiveness in terms of the outcomes. Despite this broad coverage, however, the report is silent on some important dimensions of inclusion. For example, because of the lack of adequate data, it does not discuss the impacts of climate change on city residents who live with disabilities or who belong to a racial or ethnic minorities. So in India, it could be a caste-based issue, but disability is obvious. So what is the impact? What are the inclusiveness metrics for them? That's not done here because they don't have the data. So we'll come back and continue with the other key findings as we go along. And the key findings are summaries of each chapter, and then, as I said, we'll come and look at the separate chapters with some additional information. The lighting is not very good here as I'm sitting and recording this, so some people do mind these sorts of lack of care in creating the podcast, but apologies, and hopefully the information is useful enough anyways. Okay.